Morning light slid across the marble floors like it didn't want to be noticed. The house was spotless and still, the kind of quiet that pressed on the chest. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases, but they smelled like nothing. Pictures hung in perfect rows, but no one paused to look at them. It was a place built to impress, not to breathe. Edward Langston checked his phone at the top of the stairs, then his watch, then the closed door at the end of the hall. He did this every morning, as if routine could hold a family together. His jaw was tight, his suit darker than his mood. Behind that door, his twins lay in beds by the window, small and brave and too silent for 7-year-olds. He swallowed, turned away, and took the long steps down to the foyer. The doorbell chimed. Mr. Hayes, the butler, opened to a woman with soft eyes and steady hands. She wore a simple blouse, a long skirt, and shoes polished with care. No jewelry, no perfume. Only a canvas tote and the kind of calm you earn. Grace Johnson? Mr. Hayes asked, voice clipped. Yes, sir. She smiled. Thank you for having me. He looked past her into the neat driveway, as if expecting a mistake to show itself. We run on a strict schedule. The children have therapies. We keep standards and boundaries. Understood, Grace said. Her tone was gentle, but it didn't bend. Edward stepped into view. You're the new maid? Yes, sir. Your references were thorough. Thank you. The twins are on a medical plan. Nurse Margaret handles medication and exercises. You'll keep the rooms in order and assist as asked. No surprises. He paused, eyes cool. Questions? One, she said. May I meet them? Something flickered across his face, surprise or discomfort. It was hard to tell. After breakfast. Of course. Mr. Hayes led Grace through rooms that looked like magazine pages. A library with unopened books. A piano that hadn't been touched in months. A table long enough to seat 20, but used by one. On a hallway bench, 2 tiny pairs of shoes were lined carefully side by side. One toe was scuffed. Grace noticed and kept walking. Nurse Margaret met them at the twins' door, warm eyes and a tired smile. I'm glad you're here, she said softly. They've just woken up. The room held 2 beds near a wide window. Ethan stared at the ceiling, hands folded like he was afraid to move them wrong. Ella watched dust swim in the sunshine, her face serious, her curls tied with a pale ribbon. Good morning, Grace said, stepping close and lowering herself to their eye level. I'm Miss Grace. I like warm toast, old songs, and the sound of rain on the roof. What do you like? Ella's eyes flicked to Ethan. Ethan blinked. Neither spoke, but they were looking at her, not through her. That mattered. Mr. Hayes rolled in a tray. Breakfast, he announced, setting the bowls exactly 2 inches from the edge. We avoid distractions during meals. Grace nodded. Of course. Margaret fed them with patient hands, small spoonfuls and soft praise. The twins chewed with care, as if sound might break something. When Margaret wiped a drip from Ella's chin, Ella's mouth twitched almost a smile. Almost. Would it be all right to open the window a little? Grace asked. Just a crack. The morning smells kind today. Margaret checked the wall thermometer and nodded. Mr. Hayes hesitated, then tilted the latch. Air slipped in. A hint of cut grass, a whisper of the outside world. Ethan's shoulders fell a fraction. Ella breathed deeper without meaning to. Thank you, Grace said, and the room loosened by one thread. Edward paused in the hallway and heard a soft humming he didn't recognize. The tune was simple, like something a grandmother might carry in her pocket. He frowned at himself for listening and moved on. After breakfast, Margaret guided the twins to the sitting room for gentle stretches. Grace followed with fresh linens, folding them neat and even. The therapist arrived with a tablet and a tight smile. He nodded at Margaret, barely glanced at Grace, and began. Ethan, we'll lift slowly. Ella, we'll do rotations. His hands were practiced and fast. They were also cold. Ethan's jaw tensed when his elbow was raised too high. He didn't say a word. Ella's eyes went glassy the way eyes get when the body decides to hide. May I offer something? Grace asked carefully. If you slide a small towel under the elbow, it won't dig. My boy. The word caught, and she steadied it. It helps. We follow the plan, the therapist said without looking at her. Consistency matters. Comfort matters too, she said, still gentle. He made a mark on his tablet. We're done here. When he left, the room felt heavier. Grace gathered the used towels. You both did something brave, she said softly. Brave doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like hanging on. Ella studied her. Do storms end? The voice was tiny, like it had been kept a long time in a small box. They do, Grace said. And even while they're here, we can learn where to stand so we don't blow away. Ethan tried his voice. It scratched like a door opening. Where do you stand? By the window, Grace said, nodding to the light. Where the air can find you. In the corridor, pictures climbed the wall. A wedding dance in sunlight. A carousel with 2 laughing kids. A beach day with a kite pulling hard against the string. Grace touched the frame with her eyes, not her hands. She was lovely, she murmured. Carolyn, Margaret said, joining her. Their mother. She sang every night. I can feel the echo, Grace replied. By noon, the house returned to its strict rhythm. Staff moved like clock hands. Dishes appeared and vanished without a sound. Fresh flowers were replaced with fresher ones. Grace learned the paths and the pauses, which doors sighed, which step creaked, which lamp hummed. She also learned the glances, small, sideways, measuring her without caring to know her. Late afternoon, when the twins rested, she slipped into the small chapel near the garden. 1 candle burned in red glass. She sat in the back pew and let the wood hold her up. Lord, she whispered, let me be steady. These children are carrying more than their years. Let me carry what I cannot lose my kindness when the air turns sharp. Footsteps paused at the door. She didn't turn. The steps moved on. As evening settled, she checked the twins one more time. Ethan's blanket had folded on itself. She smoothed it with a practiced palm. Ella's wrist lay against the rail. She tucked a soft cloth beneath it so the metal wouldn't mark her skin. Miss Grace? Ella whispered. I'm here, baby. Your song. It makes the room feel bigger. Grace pressed a hand to her heart. Then we'll sing it until your room has sky. In the hallway, Mr. Hayes stood with his shoulders square, watching like a guard dog that hadn't decided if you were friend or threat. He said nothing. She nodded, not asking for permission to care. She passed Edward near the stairs. He looked like a man who didn't remember how to start a conversation he needed. He cleared his throat and chose silence again. She walked to the staff quarters, the house finally breathing a little. Behind her, the window in the twins' room let in a strand of night air. The curtain lifted and fell like a slow, peaceful tide. Grace's first week in the mansion felt like walking through glass, quiet, polished, and dangerous. Every word she spoke seemed to echo too loudly in rooms not used to kindness. She followed the rules, kept her head down, and moved with respect. But respect wasn't always returned. On the 3rd morning, she pushed open the curtains in the twins' room, letting sunlight pour in. Let's get some light in here, she said cheerfully. The day looks gentle today. The twins blinked at the brightness. Ethan squinted and muttered, It hurts my eyes. Grace smiled softly. That's just your body waking up, sweetheart. The sun missed you. She lifted Ella from her bed carefully, wrapping her in a blanket. "We're going to feel the breeze for a minute, just outside the doors. You'll tell me if it's too much." Ella's lips twitched, the faintest nod. Grace pushed the wheelchair toward the back terrace, the scent of roses and trimmed hedges greeting them. The warmth touched Ella's face, and for a heartbeat, the child closed her eyes and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made pain pause, but the moment didn't last. "Ms. Johnson." A sharp voice called. It was Mr. Hayes, striding toward her like a storm in a suit. "You are not authorized to bring the children outdoors without approval." "What on earth are you doing?" Grace froze, then turned calmly. "Just letting them feel the air, sir. Only for a moment. Their schedule is precise for a reason. They are fragile. They're also alive," Grace said, her voice steady but soft. "And life needs a bit of sunlight." Mr. Hayes's face tightened. "Return them inside immediately." Edward stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He didn't intervene, didn't scold, didn't defend. Just watched. Grace obeyed quietly, wheeling Ella back in. She could feel his eyes on her, but not his voice. That silence spoke louder than anything. Later that afternoon, Nurse Margaret found Grace folding laundry. "Don't mind Hayes," she whispered. "He's just particular about the rules." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. "I understand. It's not the first time someone thought I didn't." That evening, during dinner service, the air in the house felt different, heavier. Edward's watch had gone missing. A gold one, engraved, expensive enough to cause whispers. Mr. Hayes called everyone to the dining room. The maid stood in a nervous line. "We'll check the cameras," he said stiffly. "But until then, I expect honesty." Grace stood still, hands clasped in front of her apron. Edward entered last, his tone clipped. "This watch has sentimental value. I expect to have it by morning." His eyes passed over everyone and stopped briefly on her dot. Something cold slid into Grace's chest. She'd seen that look before. That quiet assumption that some hands were not to be trusted. Later, when the cameras showed nothing, the watch was found under a cabinet in Edward's office. No one apologized. Not even a glance her way. But the wound had been made. That night, Grace sat in her small room, hands trembling as she folded and unfolded her prayer cloth. "They don't see me," she whispered. "They only see what they've been taught to fear." She went to the small chapel again, candlelight flickering against the marble walls. She closed her eyes, her voice breaking in half as she prayed. "They can't see what I see. They can't love like I love. But Lord, give me strength to keep loving anyway." Unbeknownst to her, two little faces were awake down the hall. Ethan and Ella heard her voice through the vents, soft, trembling, but full of something they hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope." Ethan whispered, "She prays for us." Ella smiled faintly. "She prays even when they're mean to her." And for the first time in months, both children fell asleep with a small, warm smile on their faces. Grace woke before sunrise the next morning. The mansion slept in its usual silence, but her heart felt heavy. She had spent half the night wondering whether she should leave, whether this job, this constant quiet cruelty, was worth carrying. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at her worn hands. They were strong hands, but tired ones. Her mind wandered to another small bed from years ago. Her son, Jeremiah. His laugh, his little fingers clutching hers before illness took him away. That pain still lived inside her, quiet but sharp. She promised him back then that she'd keep helping children who needed love. And now, standing in this cold house where love felt unwelcome, she wondered if she was keeping that promise or breaking it. She tied her apron and made her way to the kitchen. The staff were already whispering, eyes flicking up when she entered. She caught pieces of their talk, Strange woman. Too involved, acting like she owns the place. She didn't respond. Instead, she took the breakfast tray for the twins and carried it upstairs herself. When she entered the children's room, both Ethan and Ella looked up at her with sleepy smiles. It was the smallest change, but enough to soften her heart. "Good morning, my brave ones," she said gently. "I made sure the toast was just the way you like it, with a bit of honey." Ella reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and Grace steadied it. "You prayed again last night," Ella whispered. Grace froze. "You heard me?" Ethan nodded. "You said we were strong." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes. "You are. Stronger than anyone here knows." At that moment, the door opened. Edward stood there, coffee in hand, dressed for another day of meetings and avoidance. "I didn't know breakfast was your duty," he said. Grace turned to him calmly. "I don't mind. They eat better when they see a smile." He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "I appreciate your enthusiasm. Just remember, this isn't a charity house. Everything here has order. Keep that in mind." "Yes, sir," she replied softly. When he left, Ethan's face darkened. "He doesn't smile anymore." Grace knelt by his bed. "Sometimes people lose their smiles in storms, but that doesn't mean they're gone forever." She continued with the twins' morning care, brushing Ella's hair and telling quiet stories of faraway fields and singing birds. For the first time in a year, laughter filled the room, fragile, like glass bells, but laughter still. Down the hallway, Edward paused mid-step, hearing it. He froze. He hadn't heard that sound since before the accident. For a fleeting second, something in his chest softened, then hardened again just as quickly. He walked away. By midday, Grace's back ached from lifting, folding, and cleaning. She stopped by the window in the servants' corridor, letting the sunlight rest on her face. She wondered if she should send a letter to her church back home, tell them the job wasn't what she'd hoped, but that she was trying. Later that day, the tension broke again. One of the maids, Clara, caught Grace in the laundry room, humming softly. "You really think singing helps those kids?" She sneered. "Maybe that's what you people call healing. Old slave magic, huh?" The words hit like a slap. Grace froze, every muscle in her body tight. She could have shouted, could have cried, but instead, she took a slow breath and looked Clara in the eye. "I don't need magic to love," she said quietly. "Love itself is the miracle." Then she turned and walked away, her dignity untouched. That night, Grace returned to the chapel again. She lit 2 candles this time, one for her son and one for the twins. She whispered, "Let me be the light in their darkness. Even if they never thank me, even if they never see me." Behind her, the door creaked. Nurse Margaret stepped inside. "I thought I might find you here." Grace smiled faintly. "You pray too?" "Not as much as I used to," Margaret admitted. "But watching you, maybe I should start again." The 2 women sat together in silence, the candles flickering like small, stubborn stars in a mansion full of shadows. 3 nights later, the mansion was restless. The twins had caught a fever that refused to break. Doctors came and went with expensive medicine, but nothing worked. The air smelled of worry and disinfectant, and Edward paced like a man trying to fight fate with money. Grace stayed by the children's side through every hour. She wiped their foreheads, whispered prayers, and sang in her soft, steady voice. "You're safe," she told them again and again. "You're not alone." By morning, the twins were weaker. Ella's breathing was shallow. Ethan's hand was cold in Grace's palm. Nurse Margaret stood near the door, her face pale. "The medicine's not taking effect," she said quietly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Then we have to try something else." "Grace," Margaret warned, "You can't." But Grace was already moving. She went to the kitchen and found her small pouch of herbs, leaves her grandmother once used to heal children back home in Georgia. She crushed them carefully, mixing them into warm water and honey dot as she stirred. Mr. Hayes appeared in the doorway, eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" "Trying to help them," she said, not stopping her hands. He stepped closer, voice rising. "You're not a doctor. You can't bring your witchcraft into this house." Grace looked up, calm but fierce. "I'm not casting spells, Mr. Hayes. I'm using love and what I know. Sometimes healing doesn't come from bottles." He scoffed. "If anything happens to those children, you'll never work again." Grace didn't flinch. "If I can give them even a breath of comfort, then that's enough for me." She carried the cup upstairs. Edward met her at the landing, his face drawn tight from worry. "What's that?" he demanded. "Something natural," she said softly. "My grandmother taught me. It won't harm them." "Please, sir." "Let me try." He hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. The sight of Ella's pale face broke something in him. He stepped aside. "Fine, but if this makes things worse—" "It won't," she said gently. Already moving to the bedside, Grace fed the twins tiny spoonfuls, whispering between each one, "Breathe, baby. The world still wants you here." Hours passed in silence. Rain began to tap against the window panes. By evening, the fever broke. Ethan stirred first, blinking weakly. Ella followed, whispering, "Ms. Grace?" Grace pressed her forehead to their hands, tears falling freely now. "Thank you, Lord," she breathed. "Thank you." When Margaret came in and saw the children's color returning, she gasped. "It's working. Whatever you did, it's working." Mr. Hayes hovered in the doorway, speechless. Edward stood behind him, watching the impossible unfold before his eyes. That night, for the first time in a year, the twins laughed. Their voices were soft, still frail, but it was laughter all the same. Grace sat beside them, singing an old hymn her mother once sang under the stars. "Love is the bridge," she sang quietly, "between pain and peace." Edward listened from the hall, unable to step inside. Something in his chest twisted, not just awe, but shame. He had seen money fail, science fail, and his own faith vanish. But this woman, this maid he had once dismissed, had done what no one else could. "Nurse," Margaret turned to him and whispered, "whatever she's doing, it's saving them. Maybe it's time you stopped watching and started listening." Edward said nothing. But later that night, he stayed awake, replaying the sound of that hymn in his mind, the song that had turned fear into hope. The next few days passed like a quiet miracle. The twins regained strength faster than anyone believed possible. Their cheeks carried color again, their eyes followed the sunlight, and laughter, hesitant at first, became part of their mornings. Grace never claimed credit. She just said softly, "They found their light again." But not everyone in the house shared her joy. The staff whispered when she walked by. Mr. Hayes avoided eye contact, mumbling that luck doesn't last forever. Yet Grace moved through the halls with a steady calm, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Edward, though, remained distant. He watched from doorways, from behind half-closed doors. He saw the way the children reached for her, the way they smiled only when she entered the room. Something about it unsettled him, a mixture of gratitude and guilt he didn't know how to name. One evening, a storm rolled over the estate. Thunder rumbled low, and the house flickered with candlelight as the power went out. Grace made sure the twins were calm, humming softly to drown the noise. Edward was in his study, staring at the dark window, the storm mirroring the turmoil inside him. He heard it then, her voice. That same hymn, faint but clear, coming from the children's room. It wasn't just singing. It was prayer, warmth, and hope all wrapped in one sound. Without realizing, Edward stood and walked down the hall. Following it, he stopped at the door and pushed it open, just enough to see. Grace knelt beside the twins' beds, one hand resting on Ethan's arm, the other on Ella's. Her eyes were closed, her voice trembling but strong. Lord, they've carried so much. Let them feel their bodies again. Let them know they are more than what's broken. Edward's breath caught. For a second, he thought he imagined it. The small movement of Ethan's fingers, the twitch in Ella's hand. But then it happened again. His heart pounded. What are you doing to them? His voice came out louder than he intended. Grace turned slowly, her eyes wet with tears but calm. I'm reminding them they're still whole, she said softly, even when the world says otherwise. You have no right, he started, stepping forward. She stood to face him, her voice firm now. No right to care? No right to believe when you've already given up? You see weakness where I see life, Mr. Langston. They don't need your fear. They need your faith. The room was filled with the hum of rain. For a long moment, neither spoke. Edward looked at his children, really looked, and saw what he hadn't dared to hope for. Ethan's hand was moving slightly. Ella's fingers curled toward Grace's palm. He sank into the nearby chair, his composure cracking. How is this possible? He whispered. Grace knelt again, her tone soft. Love does what medicine can't, and prayer, it heals what pride breaks. The storm roared outside, lightning flashing through the window. But inside that room, something broke open, not just in Edward's heart, but in the air itself. The house that had lived in silence for so long was breathing again. For the next few days, the doctors called it unexplainable. They spoke in clinical terms, trying to wrap logic around something that defied reason. But Edward stayed quiet. He didn't argue. He just replayed the moment in his mind. Grace's trembling hands, his children's awakening movement, and the peace that had followed. Late one night, Edward sat alone in his study, head in his hands. His voice came out broken, the kind that comes from years of walls finally falling. All this time, I thought I was the savior, he whispered. But she's the one who saved us. The morning after the storm felt like a new beginning. The mansion, once cold and silent, now seemed to breathe with quiet warmth. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Sunlight spilled across the floors, and the laughter of children, real, bright laughter, echoed through the halls. Grace stood in the garden, trimming roses when she heard footsteps behind her. It was Edward. His usual commanding stride was slower now, almost uncertain. He cleared his throat softly. Ms. Johnson, he began, his voice lower than usual. Could I have a moment? Grace turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course, sir. He hesitated, eyes falling to the roses. You know, he said, almost to himself, I spent years thinking I could fix everything with enough money. The doctors, the specialists, the machines. I never realized that what my children needed wasn't wealth. It was someone who still believed they could heal. Grace listened quietly, the wind tugging at her sleeves. He looked at her then. For the first time, not as an employer looks at an employee, but as a man who has finally seen the truth. I owe you an apology, Grace, for my silence, for my blindness, for seeing color before I saw your heart. Grace's eyes softened. You don't owe me an apology, sir. You owe it to yourself and to them. She nodded toward the window where Ethan and Ella were laughing with Nurse Margaret. Love doesn't ask for status or permission. It just shows up and does the work. Edward took a deep breath, his voice unsteady. Then allow me to do the right thing now. That afternoon, he gathered the household staff in the main hall. Everyone stood in silence, uncertain why they'd been called. The twins sat nearby in their chairs, bright-eyed and smiling. Grace stood behind them, unsure whether to stay or step away. Edward faced his staff, his tone firm but humble. For too long, this house has lived by rules that had nothing to do with respect. I let judgment and pride build walls where there should have been compassion. That ends today. He turned to Grace. Miss Johnson is no longer just a maid. From this day forward, she will serve as caretaker and advisor to my children's recovery and to this home, because she's taught us all something none of us had the courage to admit. Dignity cannot be bought, but it can change everything. A murmur rippled through the room. Mr. Hayes dropped his gaze, shame creeping over his face. The younger maids looked at Grace with wide eyes, some with guilt, others with admiration. Grace swallowed hard. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Edward smiled faintly. "You've already said it. Every day you've been here." Her eyes shimmered. "Then I'll just say thank you. Not for the title, but for finally seeing." In the days that followed, the mansion changed. The routine stayed, but the air felt different. The twins' therapy continued, but now laughter filled their sessions. Margaret often caught Edward lingering at the doorway, smiling softly. Even Mr. Hayes seemed gentler, greeting Grace each morning with something almost like respect. One golden afternoon, Grace sat beneath the oak tree in the garden with Ethan and Ella. She read from a small, worn Bible, her voice calm and steady. Edward watched from the terrace, the sunlight reflecting in his eyes. He thought about everything: his late wife, his pride, his blindness, and the miracle standing before him. He realized something simple yet profound. Wealth had once made him powerful, but compassion had finally made him human. Grace closed the book and looked toward the sky. The children followed her gaze. "See that light?" She whispered. "That's what healing looks like. It always finds its way in." And for the first time in a very long while, Edward Langston, billionaire, father, man once trapped in silence, smiled without effort, without fear. The house that had once been built on cold perfection now held something priceless: Grace, both the woman and the miracle she carried into their lives.